Nomi, good to see you again. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Great, great. This is a little bit of a different setting for us. It's virtual this year, but so glad you could make it. Just less than a year ago, we were on stage exchanging a hug.
Yes, I do. I was thinking about that.
Isn't that funny?
That's right. It's so bizarre.
And this year, that's not possible. We have the new COVID hug, which is a temperature scan and a greeting. But either way, I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, that's right. And again, I did learn today new information that my temperature is less than the average temperature in general. So things I didn't know pre-COVID.
Yeah. Now you got to find out why.
Next information seeking exercise.
Cool. I love speaking with you, and I think you're a unique guest and speaker because, like last year, you can come and you can speak to a resource-oriented, sort of libertarian-leaning, economically conservative, say, group, or as you did in San Diego when I met you, an Austro-libertarian group. But at the same time, you've been an advisor to Bernie Sanders. You can go on the Young Turks and you can have the same or similar conversation with those folks in that audience. What do you think is the key to being able to appeal to such a large range of people?
Well, I guess the key is to always look at information and interpret like the data and the experiences and the events that I'm seeing unfold without really trying to impose upon them any kind of perspective. And to me, that's just a pure way of examining things. Now, I imagine over my experiences in life, etc., I may have a perspective, obviously, but I try not to come from a specific angle into anything that I analyze in terms of investments, in terms of the market, in terms of the economy, in terms of how real people are doing, particularly in these times. And I just try to stick with what is.
One thing that I think a lot of people have in common is this feeling of maybe unfairness that's going on right now. So you talk about, the banking system. That's sort of your claim to fame, is talking about the banking system, and that's how so unfair. How does sort of the left-leaning audience look at that compared to, say, what us more like Federal Reserve hawk type people look at it?
That's a really interesting question because I think the Federal Reserve has, by such an immense amount of activity, sort of overstepped what they were even supposed to do back when they were created, which was effectively to support the banks. Even though at the time that the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was passed, the idea was that it would help the Main Street economy, that when money tightened up from Wall Street, it could still go to the rest of the country. It could still go west through the farming areas, through the coast. If there were problems, and the Fed would help that along. But as we've seen more recently since the financial crisis of 2008, and now, that's not really been the case. The Fed has disproportionately helped the financial system in the last crisis. And I think in this particular crisis, in this coronavirus pandemic crisis, it's really helped banks in a different way. And it's not entirely certain that the left is really examining how the Fed has 100% helped the banks, because the banks are still complaining about sort of their lot in this particular scenario, even though the Fed is on steroids in this crisis versus the last crisis. So I think in general, we should always look at the Fed's activity from the perspective of where that money goes. And if it goes into too much debt that doesn't create real investments, real jobs, real security, I think that's an issue for both the right and the left to consider. And also if it inflates financial bubbles versus the real economy, I think that's also an issue for both the right and the left to consider.
Yeah, and I think that now it's sort of plain for everyone to see where that money has gone, right? So you have this massive asset bubble. There's been a lot of attention put into the stock buybacks, where that money went, a lot of corporate debt, obviously, and then when this recent crisis happened and there was an opportunity for, say, Treasury and the Fed to help Main Street, they really didn't. I mean, they helped a little bit just to get the bill passed, but the vast majority of the help didn't go to Main Street, did it? So what is your thought on that? Is this something that can be done? I mean, properly? Do you have a solution on how you would have done it better? Let's take the PPP, for example. How would you have done that, or is this just a mistake in your view?
Well, I'm really glad you bring this up because a lot of the way that CARES Act was covered, the 2.3, 2.1, depending on what day they were talking about it, $1 trillion fiscal package from the government was positioned, was that it would be to help Main Street. And along the way, corporations would be helped because they had people who had jobs with them and so forth, and that would be sort of a conglomerate of help. But what actually happened was a disproportionate amount of the CARES Act, of that $2.3 trillion, went to sort of seed money for the Federal Reserve to leverage into other Federal Reserve facilities. So for example, $30 billion of it each went into buying back asset-backed securities, corporate bonds, primary corporate bonds and secondary corporate bonds, for which the Fed could leverage the Treasury's money, which is taxpayers' money, 10 to 1. And so even the way it was created between the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, but really with Congress approving it, was skewed. That said, it was necessary to provide money and funding and help to the mainstream economy because everything was shut down and everybody was hurting. So some of the things in the PPP, the Payment Protection Program, that were helpful was that some small businesses were able to get some money to allow them to sort of go through the gap of having to close versus when they could potentially open. But the way in which that was done was really difficult for many small businesses, particularly very small businesses like the mom and pops of this country, because they had to have bank accounts for one thing, with the larger banks who got the disproportionate money from that program in order to lend out to their existing customers, and on and on. So a lot of people were actually disconnected from that program. There was an unemployment insurance extension, and I think that was helpful. It was $600 a week to give to people who were disconnected from their jobs. But that was a very small portion relative to the trillions that were sort of on offer for the banking and the corporate community. And so there was this disconnect from the get-go in terms of help that, yes, was needed, and some that actually has and still does help people and small businesses, but the disproportionate amount that went into sort of the ether of large corporations and large banks without accountability. So you ask, how can you have done that differently? Well, first of all, in the United States, our unemployment levels and our jobless claim levels went through the roof because in portion how that was done. In Europe and in other places, they had the same stoppages and shutdowns and lockdowns, but the way in which they created their packages for individuals allowed them to stay accountably attached to jobs. And so money that they were getting really never came out of the economy. It just continued to flow, 80% of regular salaries, but it flowed. And as a result, their unemployment figures did not get near as bad as they had gotten in the United States. Had we done that, had we actually created an accountability mechanism for the programs that were on offer, it would have allowed companies to get money in as well, but it would also have allowed that connection to remain, so the real economy could have been a little bit more stable during this time, and also individuals would have felt more financial and economic stability to their jobs and to jobs around them. It would have been sort of fed into itself, and that kind of wasn't created in that manner.
So the problem of, for instance, people maybe not wanting to go back to work for fear of losing these benefits wouldn't exist in the scenario that you described?
Well, exactly. First of all, the fact that people don't want to go back to work because they're getting benefits is a little bit bizarre. I think most people want the stability of having a job versus the instability of having benefits that could disappear. However, if they had been structured in a way where those benefits were also part of their jobs, to the extent that either the small businesses or the medium or even the larger companies could continue that connection, then it would have been, yes, a more sort of seamless, less unstable connection.
Right. Here's the problem I see, because I'm concerned that we're actually going to go into a depression. And I think you'll agree that Main Street is much unhealthier than sort of Wall Street figures that I was kind of going through before, you know, the S&P barely down, the NASDAQ barely down, indicate. And my concern is that when we talk about the economy was healthy going into this COVID crisis, this is, I guess, the bullish argument for things will bounce back quickly. Even if that's true, that old economy is gone. So what are your thoughts on when this COVID finally passes? I think we have a lot of work to do because we haven't even started yet, in the sense that we haven't let enough companies fail. and we have this whole economy that now has to reconfigure itself for a new world.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Into even this period, so towards the end of 2019, since we had the conference, really, the economy started slowing at a faster rate into the end of 2019 anyway. And it wasn't just in the United States, it was around the world. And it was because of trade tensions, it was because of credit seizing up, credit being too far extended to companies and then seizing up to banks and so forth. There was a lot of reasons why both the real economy and the financial economy were starting to kind of lose steam. In more countries, some cases than others. So U.S. GDP, for example, for the end of 2019 was only 2%. It was expected to be at 3%, and so on. It was barely alive in the UK. It was barely alive in the EU, and it's barely alive in Japan. And so things were already at a precarious position going into this period. It wasn't quite that we were zooming. And then we stopped anyway. So that was one thing that happened. Now, on the other hand, debt in general was about 3 times GDP globally. So we had this mountain of debt. We had the Fed sort of ratcheting up its easing towards the end of 2019, as did other central banks, and we had slowing economies. So things weren't rosy. So now you throw into that, a few months later, a pandemic and shutdowns and job losses and permanent bankruptcies that, basically bankruptcies that could see companies not return, and especially for small companies, and you do have to recalibrate. You definitely have to recalibrate. And one of the things that concerns me about how you recalibrate and how you plan for that kind of an uncertain future is that if you have so much money coming from an external source, i.e. the Federal Reserve and other central banks, it almost takes away the accountability, and I used that word before, but the accountability for governments or companies or of any size to plan for what they're going to do in the future, because the larger ones can look at the stock market and be like, well, the stock market's up, things are okay. At some point this will all go away and we can buy back our shares again, as they were doing at record amounts last year. And that doesn't offer an opportunity to plan. And opportunities to plan and to be solid economically, or from an entrepreneurship, from a business standpoint, from an individual personal standpoint, really come out of this kind of adversity. And so I think that is what needs to happen. Infrastructure planning for health, for the roads, for the hospitals, for everything that wasn't done going into this crisis, and add to that more technological infrastructure and speed and volume and cloud space. There's so many things that are going to be part of this new post-COVID economy that we can deploy resources into. We just need to do that.
Right. There are going to be, I think, a lot of casualties in post-COVID. The SBA is saying 20 to 30% of these small, medium businesses, I think, are not going to come back, and some very big businesses also are not going to come back. Last year you joked, I think, about working at Lehman and Bear, and you said, don't invest in a bank that I've worked at or something like that. I'm wondering if you've also worked at any airlines, car rental companies, hotels. What do you expect to happen with, for example, the airlines that are lining up for another bailout? Has historically not been a great business anyway, and now with this on top of it, are we going to see a wave of bankruptcies coming sort of into the fall next year?
I do think we're going to see bankruptcies. We're going to see consolidations. I think we're going to see sort of a lot of merger activity from some of those airlines, where sort of the ones that have slightly better balance sheets or slightly more subsidization from their governments, whether it's in the U.S. or whether it's in other countries, will sort of take over some of the smaller ones or the mid-sized ones, and we'll sort of see less actual airlines as a sort of a result of either bankruptcy or simply having that conversation before bankruptcy. Because the reality is a lot of these airlines, American, Delta, United, as did many companies, bought back their own stock last year instead of potentially reserving money. Now, we could say that they did not know there was going to be an event that was going to ground them for a long period of time. But that said, you still keep a little bit on the side. I think I also spoke last year about cash being like a thing. I think a lot of the theme of some of our Q&As were also about cash and hard assets and just having that sort of storage, and that's not really what a lot of these airlines, hotels, and so forth had done going into this. So then you have a dramatic stoppage, and yes, you will have a different consolidation of that entire space, and I think the ones that can sort of repurpose their debt, their credit lines that they have drawn upon into businesses that allow people to be secure in flying them, are going to be the ones that will do better. I know, for example, I do fly American Airlines. Not to say that because I fly them or versus working at a bank that means a thing, but I that is one of the airlines I tend to have flown quite a lot, and it concerns me, for example, that even though economically they're adding back a middle seat, that Delta isn't adding back a middle seat, and I think at some point there is going to be a market decision, open or close, as to what people feel is most safe. Versus what's most necessary to do as travel gets reconsidered. And so I think that the companies that can make those smart choices, whether COVID is here for 6 months or a year or something else happens down the line, or people are merely interested in remaining healthy, that they have to make economic versus market choices, where market choices now reference people's safety and people's health, maybe a little bit more.
Right. It'll be interesting to see if people are willing to pay for that distance and comfort. Somehow I don't think they will. But Nomi, if American Airlines goes under, you're never going to live it down. First banks, now airlines.
Totally my fault.
Before I let you go, Nomi, what are you going to be talking about at the conference?
So I really do want to talk about the through line between last year and this year, because there were some very common events that were already percolating in terms of data, in terms of central banks pivoting back to easing and so forth. And they kind of went on steroids with the coronavirus pandemic. And I'd address something called phase 2 of this post-financial crisis of 2008 central bank sort of coordination and collusion, how that was going to get bigger last year. And it was the start of it. I kind of talked about it as being the beginning of a phase 2. And phase 2 is just kind of marched on. So I do want to sort of address what that is and what that looks like in terms of the pandemic, in terms of where we go from here, and in terms of the disconnect between markets and the real economy, and how that is going to basically affect all of us and our investments going forward, because there are ways to invest, to preserve and to grow wealth and investments while still being careful and being considerate of this very uncertain time.
Can't wait. That's going to be a great talk. And I love how you slipped that word in there, collusion, a little mental reminder. Nomi Prins, best-selling author of Collusion and All the President's Bankers. Thanks for sitting down with me.
Thanks a lot, Albert.